Thank you so much for coming. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, and particularly pleased with my panel, who are really fantastic. And you won't have to have much of a word from me because they've all got so many interesting things to say. It's going to be very much focused on the market and obviously on the online market. Just two little things to say. Just recently, the latest figures have come out for the art market last year, compiled by an art economist called Claire McAndrew, and she evaluates it at about $3.5 billion per year. That was last year, but that was actually, according to her figures, only 6% of the global art market, which does include as well traditional art antiques, not just the contemporary and modern art market for art. And she also noted that the sweet spot for works of art that are sold online is between $10,000 and $50,000 or $60,000. So as you see, we're not talking $100 million Picassos yet. So I'm going to very briefly, before we turn over to our speakers, I'm very briefly tell you who they are. So immediately to my left, I have Sebastian Cwilich, who is the president and COO of Artsy, which I'm sure all of you have heard of. He comes from a math and technology background, but also was involved in arts in that he ran an arts program in Argentina, and he has also worked for Christie's in the past before joining Artsy. He worked for Christie's private sales. So to his left, we have Thomas Galbraith, who's managing director of Padlet8, another online art site. Before that, he worked for Artnet, where he ran global strategy. So you see, he has deep experience of the online market, but he is also by training an art historian. And finally, last but not least, at my very end, Anders Petterson, who is the founder of ArtTactic, and who came to this world, and he will explain what he does, from a financial background, because he used to work for JP Morgan before becoming ArtTactic. So thank you very much for being here, and I'm going to ask each of our speakers just to present very briefly their company and what they do. It will be brief, and then we'll move on to the conversation. Sebastian.
Thank you, Georgina, and thank you to the organizers of the forum and to the audience for being here. Really appreciate it. So very quickly, Artsy is an online arts company, and I thought what I'd do is say two things. One is the two things that I think make us unique in this space, and two, how Artsy is used. As we'll talk about in a minute, the term kind of online art sales needs to be better defined. So I think it's worth talking about what we do and don't do. So first, in terms of what makes us unique, number one, we are very much an arts technology company. So my background was in mathematics and technology at Bell Labs, doing software engineering. My partner, Carter, who founded Artsy, is a technologist from Princeton, who did computer science. And we really believe in this idea that you should hire the world's best engineers, designers, really competing with Facebook, Twitter, IDEO, Apple, etc., for the best design and technical talent, and combine that with art historians to create kind of a product and a platform worthy of art. So that's number one. And number two, Artsy is very much a platform. And what I mean by that is we serve other art industry players. So we began with museums and galleries, then moved on to art fairs, and now have just started working with auction houses. So we don't work directly with artists, we don't work directly with collectors to help them sell work, but rather work with existing players as a platform for the industry. And then quickly, in terms of what Artsy users do, it's essentially three uses. Number one is for education and research. So essentially people doing research online, whether it's students or a collector researching works. Number two is marketing and promotion, so people who want to connect with galleries. They see a work at an art fair, they see a work at a gallery's program, they can connect with the gallery. And number three, as we've started working with auction houses, is direct selling. So that's something we've just started to do, but that we will do a lot more of in 2015. And that's where an auction house will partner with us either on an exclusive or as just one more channel basis. And we power their auction, and our users can bid on their auctions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thomas.
Hi everyone, just wanted to second that from Sebastian. Thank you for having us all here. It's been a wonderful few days. Padlet is a 21st century auction house, essentially providing an online auction house for global collectors to transact in a number of different verticals and categories. It's 4 years old. We've been sort of pounding the pavement for 4 years, and I'm happy to say that over the past 4 years we've seen tremendous success and continue to build into new verticals, providing access to collectors all over the world for objects from fine art all the way through to now jewelry and watches and so on and so forth.
Thank you. And Anders.
Thanks, Georgina. Well, ArtTactic is, we started 14 years ago as a market research, market intelligence company, which was really, I guess, is catering for collectors, trying to help them navigate what we basically was focusing on the contemporary art market, looking at the art market as a ecological system that is based, the marketplace for us is not only the commercial transactions, but also every key player from the non-for-profit to the for-profit sector. This has led to, I would say, in the last 4 or 5 years that we are starting to explore different type of markets, particularly intersections between art and finance, which is a project that we're working with Deloitte. We're looking at art and technology, which is part of what we're going to talk about today, with Hiscox. And these are kind of research which tries to capture, I would say, a sentiment of the market. We're very much looking at the consumer side and how they react to different types of elements that might interfere with this ecological system that I'm talking about. So hopefully some of these things we will discuss later on today.
And I'd like, actually, Anders, for you to continue, because I think the first thing we really have to do is to define what is the online market. I mean, when is something, if sold online, is it just transacted online? Is the whole thing completed online? So perhaps you could talk a bit about that.
I think this is a discussion we had before coming on here. I think it's very difficult to define exactly what constitutes an online sales. As a researcher, we had to be very specific and become quite probably clinical and potentially quite conservative in our approach, because we needed to define a figure or a way of characterizing what are we actually looking at. So we decided the way we look at this is as whether it's almost a click and buy type of transaction, click or bid and click and buy, where there's virtually no interaction between the seller and the buyer, no physical interaction. So that meant that our figure, for example, compared to Claire McAndrew, is slightly lower. But at the same time, there's also this discussion that there's a big spectrum here between someone who picks up a JPEG sent by a gallery on the basis of that, has still not seen the work in a physical nature, decides to buy this work. And again, it's still a purchase sight unseen. For us, that becomes difficult to define, is that an online sale, or is that just another way of, as instead of picking up the phone or another channel. So again, I think this is sort of debatable, and I guess all of us will have slightly different views on it. But for us, it's basically where there is limited interaction and where someone can, like Padlet8, you can click and you can buy, and you don't actually need to engage with anyone. That is what we constitute for our sake, for our research as an online sales. But there is a grey zone, and I think it's a much wider market there. The problem is that if you include everything else, then I think the online market is probably much, much, much larger than the number that you just quoted.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would reiterate this idea that it's a spectrum, and I think it really depends on the art you're buying and the entity you're buying it from. So when you're dealing with primary market art that doesn't have an established market, it really is about beginning a conversation, and often the dealers who sell the art, the gallerists, want to know who are they selling to. They want to kind of give that context and explain the artist, because it's not a known entity. On the other end of the spectrum, so Artsy just did our first online auction in partnership with an auction house in LA, and there it was 24 works by very well-known artists, what you would expect from Picasso to Warhol, etc. And over there, the artists are known. There is a clear track record of what prices they have achieved, and so it becomes less important to have a conversation. And based on the market, these are more liquid objects, if you will. And so therefore, it makes more sense to be transacting strictly online. And then there's a wide range kind of in between.
Yeah, I think that's a good point in terms of the spectrum that Anders you were talking about, and Sebastian, insofar as what you're saying with Artsy, I think it's an interesting distinction because for the most part, it's a platform which is promotional. It's sort of advertising the inventory that the partners that you work with have, whereas on Padlet, where everything we do pretty much is directly from collectors who we work with and have 300 odd auctions over the past year where we actually are transacting objects online in an auction from collector to collector. So it's interesting the distinction between the two business models where I think to your point, Padlet is much more about purely transacting online, whereas and tell me if you think I'm wrong, whereas Artsy is much more about advertising or working with partners who have that inventory and not necessarily transacting that online.
Yeah, I think it depends with which partners, but certainly when we deal with gallery and art fair partners, it is very much about marketing and promotion, although it's worth noting, so we increasingly, when we, so someone sees a work on Artsy and then they can click to connect with the gallery. And one of the things that we're working on a lot recently is the number of client introductions has grown from several hundred a year ago to 10,000 a month today, is really what is the quality of those introductions, right? So if you get an introduction and just an email address, it's one thing. If you get an introduction and you know what industry this person works in, the fact that they've bought before through the Artsy platform, where they're located, et cetera, it becomes suddenly much more valuable. And this idea, for example, a confirmed buyer status on Artsy is something that is kind of getting closer to kind of a qualified collector introduction as opposed to just an email address. But it is still very much an introduction, and then it's up to the gallery to actually make the sale.
Well, I think the whole point of this is it's the difference between the virtual and the real, isn't it? And I think it's really important that perhaps we should talk immediately about buying a work of art without seeing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we do all day, every day. And it's a question that comes up quite often insofar as people sort of who are less familiar with the platform or less familiar with buying art online will ask, how do you know that what you're selling is what it is? How do you know that it's real? How do you know anything about it? And my answer is always the same. Like, we hold ourselves to the same standards as any other international auction house does. So we require all of the same information, whether it's a certificate of authenticity or an invoice from the gallery or anything to do with selling a work of art, we require exactly the same amount of information. So the standard is there, and it's present in everything that we do, and it's available on the site. You can see everything. Whether it's high resolution images and so on and so forth, or condition reports which we provide upon request, it's absolutely fundamental to our business that we make sure that what we are providing on the site, what we are letting our buyers bid on and buy, is held to a, if not as high, then a higher standard than what would be expected. Otherwise, you lose trust.
But that's a question of, yes, of trust, confidence, authenticity, provenance. But I'm interested in whether the artwork is a little bit different from something else. I mean, shouldn't there be that human contact? Shouldn't there be that interaction with the physical artwork? Anders?
I think there is a. This is looking at e-commerce overall, the trends. I mean, we were thinking about music, books, groceries. All of these things are now becoming just daily things that we do. And I think with the art, it's I think it's one of the difficulties we have by defining what is an online and what's not online is this whole thing that it's probably everything in between. It's not either or. It's actually a choice of the consumer of what they want to do. And I think, like in most other markets, that choice is now this kind of omni-channel type of experience. That it's not replacing the gallery; it's giving the gallery a voice to reach a consumer that is now spending a lot of time online. I think that consumer has a different expectation, and I think there's the same thing of this physical but it's also about trust, and it's also about the reputation of the seller. And I think increasingly, when you get into buying art, and you are the hurdles of not seeing the work. And I think that sort of JPEG culture, which has probably been 15-year-old, is something that's already, when you're getting familiar with something, it's about convenience. It's about actually being able to, and I think in many of the platforms are offering exactly this choice that I can go to the gallery, but it's kind of impractical. I don't think it's about taking away anything, because ultimately you are ending up, hopefully, with that object in your home and enjoying it. And the trust, whether it is what it is, it's about whether you trust who sells it.
I agree. I think it's a personal choice in a way. It's essentially what you're coming to. The point that you're making, I think, is an excellent one, because not all collectors are the same. Some collectors will, such as you were saying before, Georgina, is that they adamantly want to see something, and they definitely will not buy until they see it. Some people will say, well, my proxy can see it, or so on and so forth. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are people who are more than happy to buy sight unseen, whether that's what happens currently at Sotheby's or Christie's with people on the phone calling and saying, I saw it in the catalog, I want to buy it, but they haven't actually seen the physical object. And I think part of that transition, there's the sort of allowing the market to respond to the different types of collectors that are out there, but then also in conjunction with that, as the online market and as the websites and the technology has evolved to a point where now it is possible to provide highly accurate information, stunning imagery, beautiful websites, which are in themselves sort of confidence-inducing, and an ability to transact with trust and faith. If you look at what happened, or what was taking place in the early 2000s, you could, with what Sotheby's was trying to do especially, I think they were far in advance of themselves and of the market.
Perhaps you'd just say what happened with Sotheby's.
So
Yes.
they tried two different ventures back in the early 2000s. Sorry, one was in 1999, the other one was in, I think, 2002. One was with eBay, and another one was with Amazon, where they tried to bring their offering online through these different portals. And both failed. My opinion as to why they failed was predominantly because the technology couldn't support it, and the buyer base wasn't comfortable at purchasing at that price point online. So over the past 10, 15 years, what we've seen is that websites have become more sophisticated. High-resolution imagery has obviously gotten to the point where now you can dial down in on very specific detail, and people have gone from spending I don't know, $2 on toothpaste online and being worried about it, to the other end of the spectrum, where they're more than happy. For example, with us, the largest transaction that we've done online is $900,000. So it's all of a sudden there's this shift that's taken place, and on the one hand, it's an ability to cater to different types of collectors, some of whom are never going to buy online, and some of the starting to buy online. But then at the other end, there is this sort of process that's taken place with online companies and websites, where they've gotten to the point where actually people do feel comfortable transacting with that at that level.
Yeah, I think there is a fundamental shift happening, and even, I remember having a conversation with a major New York dealer maybe 4 years ago, saying that the internet might be a fad. And this is obviously a little bit behind the times, but I don't think it was that crazy. And by the way, we can laugh a little bit about it, but when you think about it, the reasons are actually very substantive. So if you are selling art, you are fundamentally selling $100, $200 worth of paint and canvas for an arbitrarily large sum of money. And so what you're selling is ultimately brand and ideas and stories. And that's something that's, on an economic terms, it's kind of the top of the luxury pyramid and very much about the brand. And so you want to be kind of as cautious as possible. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, my 2-year-old son swipes the TV screen, right? So it's very clear that he's going to be very comfortable buying online. And if you think about, these companies, Artsy has been launched to the public for about 2.5 years. The auction houses have been around for 270 years. So I think over time, this debate will really go away about are people comfortable or not buying online. Online will become a component of every sale. For some cases, it will be a kind of research and connection component. For other cases, it will be things that are just transacted entirely online. And who knows what the technologies will be that will be available so that you'll be able to walk through entire exhibitions, touch art. I mean, I really think we're in the very, very early days of the online art world.
I think it would be really interesting to know your opinion as well, is how the online market is going to impact on the market as we know it today. I mean, we're sitting at an art fair, a lot of dealers, some of them bigger, some of them smaller, some showing emerging artists, some showing in here the modern section, work by artists who are older or possibly even dead. Will this change anything, or is this just another channel, so to speak?
I'll just sort of jump right in there. Sorry, Anders. I think it's. I think it is going to change things. It's already starting to change things, but I don't think necessarily that change is at the detriment to other players in the market. It's something which I think has sort of been alluded to before. Is it impacting middle market dealers? Is it impacting auction houses and so on and so forth? And to some degree, there is change. But I mean, for example, if you look at the average price point that's selling online, when we look at our own internal data month on month, it's increasing. Like A, part of that is a larger community, but also B, like there is an increased comfort every month with spending a larger and larger amount. But whether that necessarily is to the detriment of others, I don't think so. It's kind of like, and I think it's the same to say for companies that are already online. I don't really think that there's much in the way of competition between us, because it's not it's not like it's that there's a finite amount of space. It's akin to Cork Street in London or Chelsea in New York. Like there is a huge amount of real estate that can accommodate a vast number of different businesses. So I think that there is a natural progression, and I think how the existing market or infrastructure adapts to that new reality will define how it sort of progresses over time.
I mean, I agree. I think what could change, I think, for people who do not respond to this challenge will be affected. But I think there is room for. I mean, I think the market, as we see it from a sort of ecosystem, it's a fragmented marketplace. I don't think that's going to change. The objects are still key. The one who has access to these objects, controls that channel, is still going to be in control. It's not about digitization. It's not about changing. I mean, I think the revolution is not going to happen on the supply side. It's going to happen on the consumer side. So I think the loss is going to be for those who say, well, no one's going to ever, in this case, we're talking about sales, buy online. I think they're missing out, and that's going to be a big challenge. So, obviously, having then platforms like Artsy and others, where traditional galleries can work with someone who provides that platform for them. Obviously, I think it's going to be. So the fragmentation, I think, is going to remain, but you need someone who can aggregate and aggregate this information.
Yeah, I mean, I think on a macro level, if you think about the art market today, 98%, this is a stat for the US, 98% of millionaires in the US, and of course you can collect art if you're not a millionaire, but 98% of millionaires don't buy art. And I think that's largely because the market is intimidating, it's inaccessible. And I think one part of that solution is going online. And so it's making art accessible. Our mission from the beginning has been making all the world's art accessible to anyone with an internet connection. And I really believe that the art market, which is $60 to $70 billion worldwide now, could be 10 times that size if there were greater access, if there was more ability to buy and sell more efficiently. So I really think there's an opportunity for the market to get much, much bigger. I do agree with Anders that I don't know if it's that people who don't adapt will disappear, but I think the people who adapt earliest, as with many platforms, will reap outsized benefits. So the people who join Twitter early, have millions of followers and their books get picked up immediately. The people who join Pinterest early, etc. And I think with all online platforms, the early players are going to reap outsized benefits.
So I've asked you the question about the impact that online will have on the art market as we know it. I'd be interested in your views as well about the impact on the sort of art that's made, and particularly in view of the fact that the technology platforms are going to change. So how are artists going to deal with that, and how are artists using these new technologies? I mean, there are some artists who are only online, who work for the online.
Well, I think it's technology and kind of the digital world is so pervasive a part of our lives now. From a show of hands, how many people have a smartphone in their pocket now? Right? So how many people don't have a smartphone on them? Right? Like there's not a single person in the room who doesn't have a computer that is more powerful than any computer anyone had at home 10 years ago. Right? So that's telling you if artists respond to culture and if artists ultimately are reflecting what's going on in society, this has to impact the art they make. In an extreme case, it's also kind of redefining what is art. So Artsy just launched yesterday along with Cooper Hewitt Museum and an interesting creative group called Ruse Laboratories, essentially the world's first algorithm auction. So we are selling pure code, so essentially celebrating the beauty and kind of creativity of the technologists who create code.
And it's defined as art, or it's defined as...
It's defined as objects that are culturally relevant and interesting, right? So there is everything from Brian Kernighan, who is one of the godfathers of computer science, and created this thing called the Hello World algorithm. So anyone who's learned to code, so the people who actually program our computers, when they learn to code, the first thing they write is a program called Hello World, which essentially outputs to the screen Hello World. So it's the first programming exercise that everyone does. And the person who conceived that is now kind of written that code, and there is kind of some archival material related to it.
So, yes, I think we need to come back a bit to the art, perhaps.
I think it is having an impact. And if you look at artists over any period of time, they adjust and they change and they challenge new mediums. Whether it was Impressionists working with oil paints, which were new in the late 1800s, or whether it was artists working with photography, or whether it's egg tempura. However far you want to go back, artists continually pick up new mediums and challenge them. And I think that we have to account for the fact that some of the things that are happening now are a direct result of the new technologies we have. Whether that's artists operating with websites, whether that's artists operating with digital paintings like Michael Manning or someone like that. It's inevitable that it is going to have an impact and it is going to result in change. But it's exciting to see that change, and it's exciting to be part of that. One of the things that we do at Padlet is specifically ask for feedback from artists to let us know how we're doing. Because the last thing we want to do is misrepresent artworks by artists who obviously have a deep passion about the works that they produced. So whether it's making sure that the color correction in the images that we use is correct, or whether the very sort of specific details on cataloging, whatever it may be, that is as accurate and reflects what the artist wants. We encourage artists to be part of the conversation. We actually had a colleague of mine, Dave, had a forum in LA in January, and we're doing another one in New York, and then progressing on to London and other countries, where we asked artists in the region to come to a dinner that we hosted to give us feedback, to let us know how we were doing and what they would like to see changed. And this is a completely different topic that we can get onto another day, which is about artist resale rights. I thought they would be most interested in that, but they weren't. They were most interested in images, because the images that we use, they are provided by the collectors that we work with, who can sign works to us. And sometimes those images can have slight color variations, which is inevitable. It's part of what happens when you're taking sort of, even if it's a professional photograph. And the biggest piece of feedback they had for us was, if you need an image, please let us know, because we have all the images with us, and we want to make sure that the works that we produced are represented how we want them to be represented online. And I thought that was really interesting, and we welcome it, like, all day long. If artists want to send us images or updates on their biographies and things like that, then we want to make sure that we are accurately reflecting that on our website.
And I think there's another interesting dimension, which is this fear of that the online sales or the online market's going to turn into sort of that you commodifying the art, the output that is going to be created for an audience that is. They actually just click and buy, which is sort of look very sort of consumerist. And I think that danger is unfounded. I think that market exists anyway. I mean, decorative art, you can buy that anywhere. And I think in any there's going to be people who are going to create successful businesses out of that. But I think if you talk to people, what they appreciate about the online is the diversity. So I don't think, again, it's not. I don't see artists producing art. I mean, now we're not talking about the medium using a digital, but using, creating visual imagery that's going to please the audiences because it's online. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's the diversity. If you look at all your sites, it replicates what we see in the art fair and in the biannual and so forth. So again, it's I do think from a market point of view that there are opportunities for I would say undeveloped markets for digital art, whether it's there are sedition, there are companies out there who provide opportunities for people to enjoy collecting videos or digital images which only exist in that format. And I think that market is tiny, but hopefully in the future that will be a medium for the future, and the market and the internet and technology will accommodate for that.
Yes, I mean the question also is what happens when the technology changes. And I mean, this has been already a problem with, for example, Flavin light bulbs, and they don't make the light bulbs. So I don't know. I mean, what is the future
That's
of
what
that?
keeps conservators in business, no? The constant challenge.
I think the market will, like Thomas say, I think the market will come around it. I mean, I had a conversation with a conservator regarding contemporary art 2 weeks ago, and this was exactly the question of what happens when the shark dematerializes, what happens when the photography fades, how is the contemporary art going to deal with these issues? And there's obviously huge practical, but also, I guess, sort of philosophical, when the object is changed, are you changing the meaning of the object? But as long as the artist's hand is in it, then maybe it's fine, but what about afterwards? So how is this legacy going to continue? So I think the same with technology. The market has a way of organizing this. At the moment, I think there is a lack of audience for these type of, I would say, creative output. But I think, there's great opportunities for people to start. I can see my 9-year-old son very happily buying works of sedition. I think it's great because it's on the iPad, and it's he's a collector for £9. So I think the next generation is going to come after us, and they're going to have a slightly different appetite and different interests.
But while you're on the subject of price, I mean, I think the questions that's always asked at the moment, I mean, is there some, I mean, we talked about this average price, which was up to about $50,000-$60,000.
I think
is that going to rise? Are things going to, and to what extent? Will the very, very high end ever go online?
I would probably debate that figure of 50,000. I mean, we just have a survey out now, and we asked quite a lot of people who's consumers in the space, and 80% said that below $15,000 is what they.
So you think it's too high?
I think it's too high. I'm not saying that these transactions are not happening. I think they are happening, and you're demonstrating that people will buy for a lot of money. But I think take eBay as an example. I mean, they have 5.2 billion in sales, but 95% is below $100. Now you can argue whether what's on eBay is either collectible or art, because most people would say it's not. But I think there's a lot of activity. And half of these 80% is basically below $1,000 or $1,500. So but that's fine. I mean, it's not people are going to start somewhere, and I think this is where I see the opportunities of the internet, is that it acts as an incubator, as a way of getting people inside at a low level, and then gradually the confidence will increase, and they will start as we do with all the consumer goods.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I mean, if we look at what our average price is, there's obviously a difference between the average and the mean in that case. And depending on the auction, our average runs from anywhere from about $5,000 to $8,000 or $9,000 for an average artwork. But we have sold works that are 50, 60, 70, 100, 200, 900. But the largest range of transactions is between the sort of 2,000 to 20,000 range. But on that subject, I think what's interesting is a few years ago, Google and MasterCard did a study where they looked at the online habits or rather the online demographic that was purchasing luxury goods, luxury items. And they compared a purchaser of an Hermes bag, let's call it, in online, and someone buying the exact same bag in the store. And what they found was that the person who was buying the piece online was actually more affluent than the person who was buying the exact same bag for the exact same price in the store. And the reason being that there was a time constraint for the person who was buying online. They bought that object because they wanted the object, and they didn't really care so much about the experience that went with buying that object. They knew that they wanted it, they went online, they bought it, and they got back to whatever it is that they were doing, because their time is sort of spent doing other things that may be generating further revenue. Whereas the person who went into the store was more likely to enjoy the experience, sort of be much more involved in the whole thing, and still buy the same price bag, but would not necessarily have the same urgency because they were required to be going back to their business or whatever it may be. So I think to that end, it indicates to me that there is that the online market facilitates a need to a particular type of buyer, which is increasingly more and more comfortable with spending larger and larger amounts of money on the online art market.
There's a slightly frightening overlap between luxury goods and art here, and I do hope that we can continue to make a distinction between a handbag and a work of art. But anyway, we'll pass on that one.
You should ask Richard Prince then.
Well, quite. Or indeed a few other people as well. But I wondered if there was, particularly the two of you, if there is art that's more suitable to be sold online, that the platform is better for? Is there art that's really much more difficult to sell online and that really should go through the traditional channels, the dealer, auction house channels?
Well, I mean, I think in general, it's art that is more liquid and has a secondary market is easier to sell online. So if you're buying a Warhol screen print of flowers, and it's a known object, and it's come up multiple times at auction houses that you know and trust, and suddenly there's a new one up for sale, then it's pretty straightforward. If you trust the seller, you trust that when they tell you the condition is good, the condition is good. It's a known object, and so it's straightforward to buy it. If you have a brand new artist that you've never heard of before, it's more likely that you want to deal with the gallery and talk to them about the work and maybe see the work in person. And so I think it's really kind of that spectrum on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's price point. So when you get to the very, very high end of art dealing, so above $5 million, say, art, it's a very small number of people. It's in the tens of thousands of people worldwide who buy art at that level, and art becomes like investment banking. So essentially, it is people who have personal relationships with the individual buyers and sellers, and that market is actually fairly efficient. So you have like maybe 10% margins. But when you get down to things under $500,000, then the margins are much, much higher. And the reason is because the mechanisms used to sell art are the same ones. So you have people still using this kind of Rolodex-based approach, kind of men and women in suits running around town selling art, but you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of potential buyers, and it's just not efficient without a more centralized exchange for people to learn about what's out there. And as a result, you have very high margins, and as a result, I think the market is much smaller than it can be. I think as more and more people get to see everything that's out there, more of them will come into the market.
Is there, though, a danger of homogenization of taste as well? Does the fact that the internet, can zap images right around the world, is that not a danger, and that
I don't know.
we
I
lose
think
the specificity of regions?
I can see how that might be sort of a conclusion to a certain extent, because I think there is a sort of a core propensity to sell certain items over and over and over again. But one of the wonderful things, which I think Sebastian was alluding to as well, that about purchasing items in the sort of $1,000 to $20,000 range, is that encapsulates emerging artists as well, and that's something that we sell a significant number of works is in that space. Every month we have a contemporary sale which has, it's at the bleeding edge of the market in terms of artists and desirability, and it's fascinating to watch, because we can see that there are, literally there's a sort of a J-curve, like a crazy sort of jump into a specific artist's market, and we're lucky enough to be able to be at the front of that and really offer works in quick succession, which are geared towards a brand new market in that sense.
I would agree. I would say it's probably the opposite, because I think if you look at the art market as it is now, and you look at Sotheby's Christie's, who are obviously not the only auction houses, but if you look at their sales, I would call that homogeneous. That is 25 artists, the same artist again and again. And I would argue that the actual internet does the opposite. It provides hopefully more platforms, whether they're auction or whether they are primary sale, whatever it is, a diversity and a choice, and again entry points. Because I think the difficulties now is that although Sotheby's and Christie's are successful, at least from a sale point of view, not necessarily from a profit, it is it's a difficult market for anyone to enter. And I think in a sense the online market lowers the barriers, both in terms of price but also in terms of accessibility and less intimidation. So I think at the moment actually the art market is very homogeneous from the market point of view. Not saying the output, not what we're seeing here, but from the auctions in particular, it's very narrow. And I think that hopefully the online can actually address that.
Yeah, and to give a very specific example, so one of the things we do at Artsy is we have something called the Art Genome Project, whereby every single work that we put on the site, there is an art historian who looks at it and essentially assigns certain genes or categories to the work. And that's actually by especially smaller galleries that are selling works that are less known. It's a great discovery mechanism for their artists. You have a gene that can have a degree of specificity that's inherently very interesting. So, there's of course genes like pop art and seriality, but there's also genes like averted gaze. And that can cut across art that is very expensive to art that's very inexpensive. And these ways of kind of discovering art, I think, intrinsically are going to create a more heterogeneous experience.
I think, yes, Sultan.
So we have three questions from online. One of them is, what is the return policy on your websites? The second question is, do you represent artists who or do you sell artists who are not represented by galleries? And number three, are you looking for the standard arts that are sold in auctions or regular auctions, or are you looking for something new that didn't exist in the standard auctions?
Do you want me to jump in on all three of those?
It's an open question.
I think each of you should answer. Well, perhaps.
In terms of the return policy, we provide, as I said before, all of the information required for that any other auction house would require. If an object upon its arrival is materially different or the condition is different from as advertised, then we will cancel the sale. So there is a return policy. You can return the artwork.
And if you just don't like it when you get it?
That's too bad. I mean, you should have known that before you bought it.
Heavy temperature all the same.
Exactly. I mean, honestly, it really is. Bids are binding. It's just like any other auction house. Like if you raise your hand in the middle of an auction at Sotheby's or Christie's, that's a binding bid. We are the same in that sense. If the work is different from as advertised, if the condition is different, if it doesn't meet certain expectations in terms of how it was catalogued, then of course it would be returned. It's a very friendly user basis.
So that was the first question. So we'll take the first question.
Sure, and yeah, and so because we are a platform for whether it's an art fair, a gallery, or an auction house, essentially we are not part of the transaction in that way, and it's up to the auction house or the gallery, and they just use their same practice that they would use if someone bought it on the phone.
But does that mean that you're very careful before you work with somebody? Because otherwise...
Correct. And so we obviously care about our users having a good experience. And as a result, probably, I'd say now 60 to 70% of the galleries, for example, that apply to be on the Artsy platform are in fact not accepted. And we use the same kinds of criteria that, for example, an art fair might use in selecting whom to bring on as exhibitors.
But if something doesn't work out, if somebody transacts on Artsy, buys something and they don't like it, they send it back, they don't get reimbursed, you wouldn't get involved? Or what would you do?
And so just to be clear, right, the options are we can have just made an introduction. So someone sees a work on Artsy, they contact the gallery. And we might help them to try and work out the issue with the gallery. Although technically it's not our responsibility, we might help them and encourage them kind of to do the right thing, right? If we had a gallery that was constantly involved in problems with our users, we'd probably kick them off the platform. And in fact, we've done that before.
Oh, you have, yeah. So the second, sorry.
Just very quickly, because I think it's a very valid question, because it addresses not only the practicalities of having a returns policy. I think a returns policy in the art world is not something you normally have. I mean, you view it partly because you did buy it physically. And I think it's an example, again, of regulation that is happening now with the EU directive, etc. We will affect online entities that are pure online. And particularly auctions, obviously, because you are, on one hand, a binding agreement at the time when the hammer goes down. At the same time, by law, you are supposed to then be able to return it. Those two are conflicting. But even from a gallery point of view, I mean, normally there's the trust that when you sell something, you don't want it to be sent back because it happened to not like the colors and didn't fit the curtains. I think the more you're starting to see, but that's the consumer mind that they have in other businesses. So if you buy clothing or buying luxury, you can return it. And I think that's something that's probably will need to be addressed, because it's also about, I don't know, it's also about conduct. It's how the traditional art world has been conducting themselves when it comes to commitment. And that commitment might not be there. And I'm not saying, but that the new online consumer might exactly, potentially, well, they feel confident because the returns policy is there. But the same, when they start using it, the question is how the sellers then will respond to that.
I think there's actually an opportunity so for example, galleries do this all the time, right? They send works on approval to a client's house. And, when I was at Christie's and then at Haunch of Venison, you knew that essentially if you sent a work on approval, it was almost as good as sold. And you do everything you can to get that work on someone's wall, knowing that the ones that come back are a very, very small fraction. And I think over time that may, in fact, become more and more standard. As you see that the number of people who actually take advantage of these things are very small, especially if you do a good job, as Thomas was talking about, of kind of representing what the work is and giving the condition report and giving information about the work and giving install shots, images, etc.
So, Sultan, what was the second question? Sorry, I've become distracted by the first one.
The first one was...
The first one was what happens if you want to send it back?
Yes,
Return
return
policy? What
policy.
was the
Second, are you
one?
looking for any artworks that don't exist in standard auctions? And I
That's
might
right.
just pass the mic to Shumon to add one last question, maybe.
Yeah.
Sure, well,
sorry,
shall we?
you maybe take
Yes,
that one
let's
on
take
and
that one, and then we'll.
one more. Yeah.
Okay.
So on the auction side, I would say 90% of what we do is in the secondary market. On occasion, we will work with artists who are consigning straight from their studio. It has happened a couple times, and in some instances, we've actually done sort of small 20, 30 odd lot auctions, nothing particularly large, which has been a focus on primary market artists as a way to sort of speak about or introduce a new group of artists from a specific region to our buyers and to our platform, to sort of reiterate that this is an ongoing conversation that we're having with artists in different regions. So we did it in New York, we've done it in London, we have one coming up in Berlin where we are specifically focusing on primary market works. But in terms of most of what we're doing, it is secondary market. We tend not to work with consignments directly from artists. It's much more collectors, to be honest. I mean, we have a significant number of our consignments. The vast majority of our consignments come from collectors who want to participate in our platform, who want to trade on the platform and sell to other collectors. So we've actually launched a new initiative which is on our app, where you can actually take a picture of anything that you want to sell in your house and sort of submit it, or in your collection, submit it to us for valuation and then put it up on the site. On the artist side, as I was saying before, what we're more interested in is making sure that they feel like they're part of the process, and making sure that they feel like we are accurately representing their works. We're less sure about, or less convinced that we want to get into the primary market space.
Okay, Shumon.
Okay, and just two more before we kind of wrap it up.
Because we've got to open. Perhaps other people have questions.
Oh, sure,
so
of
go
course.
ahead.
So this question is, it was said that 98% of millionaires in the US do not buy art. Is it because of access, or is it because it's too intimidating? Why do you think?
Yeah, I think both of those are true, right? So the kind of stereotypical walking into a gallery and people not giving you the time of day, maybe based on the shoes you're wearing or the watch you aren't wearing, which, by the way, for dealers in the audience, especially in the tech community, is a really, really bad way to check if people have money or not. So I think the intimidation factor is there, the access is there, but I think as people become more comfortable, and online is one channel, the other channel is frankly just dealers who are becoming more savvy and who are adapting to kind of a new world, and this idea that kind of intimidation and exclusion should be kind of the modus operandi, I think is giving way to something which is a little bit more open, and recognizing that there's a lot of new buyers out there that are possible to find if people are a little bit more open.
I would like to open up to. Do you have another one, Shumon?
I do, but I think you're right. We should go to the floor, and I've got one more.
Perhaps, are there any questions before I take Shumon? Yes, well, we have one right here. Could you wait for them? It's not very far away. Wait for the mic.
You have the mic.
I have a few questions, actually. If it's okay to ask two, though.
Yes, ask two, but ask them
They're short.
briefly, please.
If they're short.
Very short.
One of them is, what's your curation process like? And the second one is, this reminds me a little bit about the music industry back in the day when the internet comes out and it changes the scene. How, if you think it can, how can it maybe affect artists? You guys did talk about that, but do you feel that this could be a tool for empowering artists, actually, the way that the internet has been for music?
Who wants to? So, curation?
In terms of curation, all of our specialists have very deep experience, whether it be in the gallery market or whether it be from auction houses, and in some cases other online entities. So the way in which our auctions are put together is very well thought out, everything from putting together a wish list of artists that we think are interesting right now, and going out and asking collectors that we work with and people in the trade that we work with to say, hey, do you have works by these artists? And then putting them together. And as you may have seen on the website, it's put together with a significant amount of thought. So we really do think it's not just a matter of sort of throwing things up on the website. We really do think about the layout of works as they relate to each other, and we try and tell a story as you look through the auction. So it is very important in how we present works, and it's very similar to what you would see in some cases in how auction houses put their sales together. There's a rhythm, there's a reason why one work follows the next, and so on and so forth.
And the other question, sorry, did you want to, because in a
No,
sense your galleries curate?
Exactly. So we select the galleries, and the galleries then curate.
And so the second one is empowerment of artists. Are these platforms, is the internet going to empower artists?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think yes. I think the answer for me is yes. I think there is a if we go on the assumption that this market will grow and that the online provides a new platform for artists, I think the growth of social media, the way we engage with art, will create opportunities. I think it's not that as a result of it, it's going to be obviously as a big market where a lot of people are going to try to find a voice. I think there still is a need for intermediaries. There's still need for people who can curate online content and drive people. And I think that's still so. The platform in its or the online, the presence or the app or the presence of online is not going to solve the issue. I think there still is a need for people in the art world that just might take on a slightly different role than they had in the past, and also obviously opening up for new players to come into this space and provide that service for artists that maybe in the past would have no voice at all.
Yeah, and I would make two quick points on that. One is, I think the art market is being maybe changed more by offline forces than by online forces. So, UTA announcing that they're starting an agency to represent artists is, the jury's still out on what will happen, but I think that's a significant development and mirrors trends that have been going on in other regions with artists having multiple representations and simultaneously selling out of the studio. So I think that's one big factor. I think the other factor is artists will, as there's a larger and larger market and a larger and larger online audience, that will undoubtedly give artists more opportunities than they have.
And, there you are.
Hi.
You had one other question, I think, that had been
tweeted. There was one which was about basically how the focus so far had been on buyers, but whether there was going to be a kind of almost retrofit impact on artists, in the way that in the music industry you could argue that it's made certain bands less profitable that were profitable, but it's also opened up anyone in their bedroom to kind of distribute their music. So there's sort of plus and minus. Is that something that we will also see happening? Is it also happening the same?
Well, I think galleries have two main sides of the function, right? One is finding artists, representing them, helping them develop their careers, etc. The other side of it is finding buyers for those artists. And I think on the side of developing artist careers, you're talking about very individual work, which is essentially kind of strategy consulting, if you will. And I don't think there's huge opportunities, and it's the reason that Artsy is not in that space. Whereas on finding buyers, I think on that side, the opportunity is tremendous. I think the notion, that you just open up your gallery and people will walk through the door is very, very antiquated. This is not, kind of 1970s and being in like the Soho Gallery building on West Broadway, that people will just walk into the gallery because there's only a handful of galleries that matter. Right now, we have a lot of the art world that has descended on Dubai, and then we will go next week to Brussels, last week in Hong Kong, and so on. And so I think in this increasingly geographically dispersed and kind of fragmented buyer community, there's really an opportunity to help galleries, auction houses, and others reach a larger audience.
Okay, thank you. We're out of time, I'm afraid. I think we could have continued a long time. but I really would like you to thank very much our panelists who've been fantastically clear and helpful. So thank you to them.